Well, who would have thought when MCC was founded 46 years ago last weekend that pastors in MCCs all over the United States would be able to say these words from their pulpits today? Thank God we can now get married even in North Carolina. And in Indiana, and Oklahoma, and Utah, and Virginia, and Wisconsin. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like 30 states now, but it's the North Carolina one that just gets me. It's like, wow.
Florida's missing.
Yeah, it's not Florida yet. Now that would be a big day when we get to say that. We will get there. This week has been all about marriage equality, about wedding banquets, so to speak. So it is fitting that our scripture today that Karen shared with us is all about a wedding celebration, this one hosted by God. Each and every one of us has already received an invitation to attend, no matter who we are. The question is, though, how will we RSVP? Will you pray with me, please? God, our Creator, our Sustainer, we do worship your holy name this day. God, help us to worship specifically in this time, to opening those parts of ourselves that we have perhaps until now kept closed off to you. Those parts, God, that might help us to understand just how much we are invited into your dominion and to be a part of your dominion. May your Holy Spirit be in this place. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing to you now and always. Amen. Amen. So this scripture passage we heard this morning, Jesus invites his hearers to learn once again about the dominion of heaven by sharing this parable. And it's a story that he told along with several of them that all happened in the Gospel of Matthew right before his big showdown with the political and religious authorities who were out to end him, basically. So all of these stories have a sense of urgency and a sense of bigness about them that may be missing in some of the other parables. It's a complicated parable, so let's do a brief recap, okay? So, the parable Jesus shared. There is this king who gives a wedding banquet for his son. And not only does the king send out servants with invitations to his subjects once, but the invitations actually go out twice. You know, kind of like you get a save the date mailing and then you get the actual invitation. So they get two of those. And then when it's finally time to come to the wedding, the servants go out to get the people, but Jesus says in the parable, they made light of the invitation. They didn't really pay attention to it or take it seriously. One person said, oh, I need to go off and tend my farm. And another person said, oh, I got to go take care of some business matters. But still others were even worse. They actually killed the messenger, literally. They would kill the slaves who came with the invitation. And the king was enraged, and so he sends his troops to slaughter all those people who didn't say yes to the invitation. And he burns their cities and their villages. And he sends out his servants again, and he says, this time I want you to go out into the streets and bring in everybody, the good and the bad, invite them all. Come in. And so they do. And the banquet hall is filled. And the king is there celebrating that finally the banquet hall is filled. But then he sees someone not appropriately dressed for such a grand celebration. And he goes up to that person and says, dude, what are you doing in my celebration? Wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I know you're from Florida. Come on. And it says the person was speechless. And the king says again to his servants, take this person, bind him, throw him out, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, because many are called and few are chosen. So before we go very far with this parable at all, let's just admit this from the get-go. There's a lot that is not to like about this parable. Yeah. Do you agree? Yeah. My first thing that I really, really don't like about this parable is the traditional way that it is interpreted. And here is the traditional interpretation. It goes like this. God, of course, is the king. And Jesus, of course, is the son that God, the king, is giving the wedding banquet for. And God invites the Jews. And the Jews reject the invitation. They reject Jesus. So God destroys them. Then the Gentiles are invited. They say yes. Jews, bad. Christians, Gentile Christians, good. The Christians are the good guys who accept Jesus. End of story. Blah, as I said at the 9 o'clock service. And that's the appropriate theological term. This anti-Semitic traditional interpretation has a really big problem with it. And that is this, that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew was Jewish. The early followers of Jesus were Jewish. Probably the majority of the people who made up the early church were Jewish. The Gospel of Matthew was written when Jewish followers were a significant part of the early church. So probably whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew did not have Gentile Christian triumphalism on his mind. That was not the point of writing the story. So there must be a different story. Are we all agreed on that one?
Yeah.
Then there is this thing with all the violence. I mean, how many of us just can't stand these portrayals of God who, when you make him mad, he comes along and just mows you down? Anyone get enough of that one growing up?
Amen.
And that's what it looks like in this story, that it paints God as a tyrant who murders and destroys with rage when the invitation is denied. There's a really good reason not to follow this God, if indeed this was an accurate portrayal of God. But we have to remember a couple of very important things. The Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel according to Matthew, is the Gospel according to someone who wrote this book, who was themselves a human being. So it is their interpretation of the Gospel. There's a difference, right? It's their interpretation. They wrote it through their lens. And unfortunately for the person who wrote the Gospel of Matthew, their lens had a lot to do with weeping and gnashing of teeth, because it was written in a weeping and gnashing of teeth kind of time. The book of Matthew was written right about the time the Romans had come along and utterly destroyed Jerusalem, had just laid waste to the city. That was everything to the Jewish people, had destroyed the temple. If you were Jewish, everything about your life was pretty much over. Everything you had known was over. Matthew wrote this parable in the shadow of the smoldering ruins of what had been the very center of Jewish life for centuries. So if you sense an angry tone in this parable, there's a really good chance that's where it comes from. But the other thing that's important to remember is that both Matthew and Jesus like to use hyperbole. Hyperbole is extreme exaggeration used to the point of absurdity, which is done in this parable. There's another story. Do you remember where Jesus says about cut your right hand off if it offends you? That's hyperbole. Are we all really clear on that one? Of course, Jesus didn't need to come along and hack your head off if it offends you or commits a sin. He was using hyperbole, extreme exaggeration, to make a point, to say this is really important. And Jesus used parables to shake people up and to get their attention and say, think differently, think outside the box. And it is very likely that that is what is happening as well. That God is not the king that comes along and mows people down. That's not who the God is that Jesus served. But I'll bet people paid attention when they heard the parable. So put brackets around all that stuff. That stuff that is difficult about this parable, so that we can actually pay attention to what is really good and life-giving about this parable. So that we can really pay attention to what Jesus was trying to communicate. Because there may not be a lot to like in this story, but there's a lot to love in it. Starting with this. That this is not a parable about condemnation or judgment or violence. It is first and foremost about the dominion of heaven. It's about the dominion of God. That was Jesus' favorite topic in the Gospel of Matthew, what the dominion of God is like. But don't be confused. Jesus isn't talking about life in heaven. The dominion of God is not about the life we finally get to enjoy when we die.
That's right.
The dominion of heaven is about right here and right now. It's about bringing heaven to earth. That's what Jesus loved to teach about. And the very first words of this parable, the dominion of heaven is like. This is a story about what the dominion of heaven that we are supposed to inhabit is like. And hey, good news, it's a party.
Yay.
It's a big party. It's a big, huge celebration, a feast, a royal banquet with beautiful decorations and abundant food and dancing and a great live band. Kind of like Devil and Diamonds, only bigger. Maybe they're romantic horses and cowboys, but you know. It's a big, huge, amazing, wonderful, mind-blowing party. And it is built around a celebration of love. This is what God invites us to. How many people, when you think of being a Christian, you think, a party? What a tragedy. That when people think of Christians, they think fun people, people who laugh, people who clearly show abundant life, people who celebrate life, who live in gratitude, who share abundance. I know I always think that way when I think about Christians, because, I think about us. But there are a lot of folks out there who, well-intentioned, it doesn't quite come across that way, does it? It's more about what you're not allowed to do. No dancing, no movies. If you grew up how Jeremiah and I grew up, that's
No cars.
the way we are. No makeup. Cars are home. No fun music. No any of that stuff that adds joy and celebration to life. No sense of humor. But I think nothing could be further from what God invites us to. And I think that is one of the great gifts of MCC to the larger church.
Yes. Yes.
Whether that gift wants to be accepted or not, we freely offer it, do we not?
Yes.
It can be kind of a shock, actually. I did grow up in a very sheltered thing. I mean, I wasn't as bad as Jeremiah. Jeremiah really was like no movies, no nothing, although he did confess he got to watch TV this morning.
But, we were always in church, so.
Right, you're always in church, yeah. So, I came from this background, you don't dance, you don't gamble, you don't go to movies, you don't do these things. And even the college that I went to, the Baptist college, dances were not allowed. And so you would get up in the morning, sometimes on Friday mornings, and someone would write in the sidewalk in chalk, "Function tonight, 8 p.m., VFW hall." That's what they were called, functions. There was a lot of functioning going on, let me tell you. It wasn't called dancing. That was the environment I grew up in. So imagine my surprise when I went to an MCC for the first time and discovered they do things like show the Rocky Horror Picture Show for Halloween, and a lot of the men are in stockings. That kind of stuff, it's fun, it's celebratory, it brings laughter and joy to life. That is one of the major things that we offer. And I think it's a great reminder of the joy and celebration God invites us to. Heaven is not the thing we're supposed to hang on by our fingernails for until we finally make it through life and, oh yeah, I finally get to be happy. God invites us to the banquet, to the celebration right now. And there's something else to love about this parable. That no matter who may have initially been invited to the wedding, ultimately everyone is invited to God's wedding feast. Everyone, the good and the bad, as it says in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, who is good, who is good and who is bad is all a matter of perspective, isn't it? I'm sure there are people in churches in Palm Beach County today who would say that we who are gathered here really have no business getting an invitation from God.
Yep.
Well, will they be surprised?
Yep.
And I'm sure for many of us in this room, there are people who are getting an invitation that we would struggle with. Here's the thing. We don't get to come up with the invitation list. It's God's list. And everybody is on it. No matter what anyone says, I am on the list to receive an invitation. You are on the list to receive an invitation. Which brings us to the heart of the matter of this parable. What will we do with God's invitation to come to the wedding? To be a part of the dominion right here and right now. And you might say, well, what do you mean? I'm here, aren't I? Just stepping into the banquet is only the beginning. How will we RSVP? Whether we RSVP? It's a really big question for reasons that are really different for us than they were for those folks who heard Jesus for the first time. I mean, let's face it, for most of them, life was awful. They didn't have enough to eat. They maybe had one piece of clothing to wear. They lived in hovels. Many, many, many of them, if not the majority, lived in terrible poverty. So of course they're like, hey, a lavish banquet, sign me up, I'm there. But for you and me, and many, many people in churches in the United States, although not all, most of us have enough to eat. Most of us have at least decent clothes to wear, if not the designer labels we wish we could wear. Most of us have decent homes to live in. And by decent, I mean with running water and electricity, because that's what most people in the world do not have. We have umpteen zillion choices a day for recreation, for distraction, for entertainment. Doesn't make any of these things bad. I'm just saying there's a whole lot. We have a plethora of things around us that can make us happy, that can invite us and distract us. Very little is ever denied to us. Now we can even get married just about anywhere. Life is good, as the t-shirt says, and that's okay. But God doesn't invite us to a wedding or to a life or to a dominion that is just good. God has invited us to the very, very best. And I think so often good enough becomes the enemy of the best because, well, life is already good. Sometimes it takes some effort to get to the best. And that's hard to do when life is already good. We can get married everywhere now. So we lay aside God's invitation. Or maybe we get too busy. Or we make other things a priority. And we might miss the forest for the trees. It's kind of like this. Wow, we can get married now, just about anywhere. Oh yeah, those kids still getting beaten up in school, but they'll be able to grow up and get married anywhere. We're okay with the good we have now. But the best is what God calls us to create and to celebrate together. It's so easy to forget that justice is not just for us, or that God is calling us to be part of something even bigger and better for everyone. God is continually calling us, inviting us to be a part of a celebration where everyone gets to enjoy the feast and dance and experience abundant life. But sometimes we put God's invitation on top of that unending pile of junk mail. Ron Hartgrove was lamenting to me just yesterday. The other day he got 15 pieces of junk mail in one day and he just wanted to scream. And is that not a metaphor for our lives? How easy is it for that invitation to end up on that pile, or even worse yet, in our email, where God knows it will never be seen. Or maybe we do see it and it gnaws at us, but we're afraid to open it because, well, we might not have the right thing to wear. Or we might not fit in. We might not really be accepted. We might not know anybody there. We might not know what to say. We might just be too self-conscious. Maybe we've been taught too much that we're just not really invited. So we can't bring ourselves to attend such a grand affair. Or we say we'll get around to RSVPing later. All kinds of things get in the way, and before we know it, we've missed the party of the century. Or the millennia, or I guess in God's time it would be the party of eternity. We've missed it. Doesn't mean we're bad people. But when you already have the good, it's just really easy to forget that God's offering the best. I'll never forget something that happened in my life that this parable brings up for me. I'm having trouble remembering it, which means something important is trying to be said. It's a memory that I have regret about to this day. Who here has seen the movie Milk? Really good movie, wasn't it?
Milk.
This whole Milk.
Oh,
Seen Milk, right? Sean Penn.
Mm-hmm.
It's the story of Harvey Milk, the great gay civil rights leader. He was the first openly gay supervisor elected to the Board of Supervisors in San Francisco in the 70s. And he was at the vanguard of the gay rights movement, and he really helped defeat the Briggs Initiative, which was this horrible law trying to get passed in California that would have criminalized gay teachers in the schools. They would have been allowed to teach. And he was a hero, and rightly so, to our community until he was assassinated. But he was a great hero doing great work up until then. And Harvey Milk made his living with a little camera store. And this camera store was actually in the Castro district on Castro Street in San Francisco. And if you haven't been to San Francisco, the Castro district is the heart of gay Mecca, right there. And he had a little camera store. So when the movie was being made, a great deal of it was shot right there in the Castro district, right on Castro Street. And in fact, a lot of our friends were extras in the movie because they needed throngs of people to walk through the Castro while they were filming. And the church that I was pastoring was 3 blocks away. And so when the movie was done being made and when it was being released, the opening night was a huge deal. The opening premiere night was at the Castro Theater, which is this grand, old, wonderful, amazing movie place. If you ever get to go to San Francisco, you must go to the Castro Theater. And so the premiere was there. It was a huge red carpet event. Sean Penn was there, the directors, the producers, all the stars, everybody was at this event. It was a huge deal. And I was the pastor of MCC San Francisco. And someone in the congregation called that afternoon and said, I have, unbelievably, 2 extra tickets to go to this event. Would you like to go? And guess what I said? No. It wasn't I didn't want to go, but I had a meeting that I had to go to that night. I had a work thing I had to do. And so I did not go. And there are a couple of reasons why I didn't go. One really was I had a meeting. But really? I was so locked into my to-do list. So locked into what had to get done. I can tell you to this day who the meeting was with or what it was about. Clearly wasn't that important. But boy, it was important in that moment. But the deeper reason why I said no was because I didn't think I was worthy of the invitation. I had been a volunteer clergy at MCC San Francisco for 10 years before I got called to pastor the MCC in Wichita Falls, Texas. If you want a cultural ice bath, that's it. But then I got called back to pastor MCC San Francisco, and I went. But I had been volunteer clergy there for so long, I could not picture myself being the senior pastor of MCC San Francisco, even though that's what I was. And I was too self-conscious to go. Would I have the right thing to wear? Oh my gosh, there's going to be all these bigwigs there. I'll have to be really on. I can't do it. I was afraid. And that was the real reason I said no. But the reason I gave the person was, well, I have this meeting. They never came to church again. And I think they probably had a great time. And me, I will go to my grave with that regret. Opening night of Milk in the Castro district with Sean Penn. Boy, what was I thinking? Why did I say no to that invitation? I was too small to attend, too nervous to attend, too busy to attend. My life didn't fit that party, and I missed out, and I would still regret that decision to this day. There is a whole other part of this parable about the person not properly dressed, about the many are called but few are chosen part, but that's a whole other sermon, so I'll save that for another time. But the important thing for this today is this. Every single day, God invites us to milk. Every single day, God sends each one of us a gilt-edged invitation, not an Evite, the real kind you can hold in your hand, on heavy paper, with beautiful calligraphy, inviting us to attend the Dominion of Heaven party, to be an essential part of everything that it is. And if it is hard for you to picture that, then try this instead. Picture God as Auntie Mame. It's an old movie. But picture God saying, life is a banquet, and most poor suckers are starving to death. We are not called to starve. The feast is prepared. We need not settle for good when God is offering us the very best. choice is yours and mine. How will we RSVP?
Amen.